Thank you for joining us for Americans for Limited Government News. Today we have a very special guest with us. She is Jessie Jane Duff. Many of you may already know Jessie Jane. She's been familiar in conservative circles for a number of years. Jessie Jane is a retired Marine Corps Gunnery Sergeant. And what we want to talk to her today about is a move by Senate in the National Defense Authorization Act to require women to put their names in for selective service, which essentially would be putting them in the draft. And we have never seen that before in this country. Jessie Jane, welcome to our show, and explain to me what your views are on this. I think a lot of people are a little alarmed that this sort of came out of nowhere. I don't think there's been any public debate or discussion. What are your views?
Well, in all reality, it didn't come out of nowhere because President Obama lifted the combat exemption for women. And many American women decided to just stay quiet. They did not research the issue. They thought of it as an equality issue. And there was little or no debate on the topic. In fact, there probably was no resistance other than by the United States Marine Corps. The Marine Corps applied for the exemption to this mandate by the president, stating with a 3-year study and roughly about $36 million spent of taxpayers' money, they put in women in infantry training school in the United States Marine Corps. Now, mind you, these women are already the best of the best. They already graduated boot camp. They graduated Marine combat training. These women were probably the most physically fit that you would ever find, and the best that we would probably not find on average in society today. However, when they did this study, they found that roughly only 35% of the women graduated infantry training school compared to 98% of the males. Then the commandant, this was General Dunford at the time, he went on to do this study in 29 Palms, California, which is where most of our combatant training goes today because of the desert warfare conditions. The women performed an integrated training with the men, and the non-integrated male units outperformed the integrated units. Roughly, it was only a 69% success rate for the integrated units. Now, mind you, that doesn't sound horrible, but keep in mind, you're not taking average civilian women. These are women that have already been conditioned in training, probably for the good past 6 months to several years of their life. There was a female sergeant involved, along with other more junior female Marines. They noticed in this study that there was an injury rate of 3 to 10 times the rate of men, depending upon what injuries and what part of the body we're talking about. The muscle skeletal structure of the women is designed completely different. They noticed that there was a much lower rate of performance when it came to shooting. Now, mind you, I want to be very careful when I say this. Women are incredible shooters. I, for one, am an expert. I'm very good at it. But we're not talking about in a combat operation where I'm running with a heavy load on my back, having to drop down and fire a weapon. Our heart rate now is impacted, our breathing is impacted, and our endurance is impacted. Roughly, women have 45% less muscle mass and 20% less lung capacity. So let's talk about what the purpose of the draft would be. The draft is to replace your combatant units. That means if we are in an overwhelming situation where we have to have combatant forces, such as like we had at D-Day, such as what we had during World War II, throughout the European sector and that of the Pacific, we need to replace combatant forces. And that's why men are drafted, because overwhelmingly, they will surpass women in the draft. We're talking about roughly maybe a less than 10% of the women in society as a whole would be qualified for not even combat. We would have such a small percentage eligible to go into combat of women. It is disproportionate to put this type of funding behind something so absurd. Maybe 10% of women in society as a whole, if not less, can even serve on active duty in the military, not just the Marines, in the military in general, because we have a very low rate of men who are even able to perform in the military. So now you're going to saturate the process to draft men and the women. That is going to cost how much money and very ineffective, only to find that you're not going to even be able to get them to enlist. So this is absurd. They're making it about equal opportunity, not about combat readiness. This was already presented to the Supreme Court previously on why we draft just men, and they cited that it was a very fair process because of the rate of men passing and being able to be included into the draft far surpass the capabilities of what most women in society are able to do. Women are not denied any of their constitutional rights. This is not a constitutional issue. And it was several decades ago that this ruling was made by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court are not denied the opportunity to serve. Let's keep this very clear. In fact, because of President Obama, if a female is qualified to serve in the infantry, there's nothing to stop her from volunteering and participating in the training and going on to serve in a combat position. The fact is that an overwhelming number of American women are not qualified for the infantry or combat. When you look at the proportionate rates, now people would push back to me and say, well, men aren't qualified either. Very true. But if you're going to put these resources into a draft, many of the men that would not be eligible for combat could be put into support roles. We do not draft for support roles because we already have a very high number of volunteers that are filling those roles. We don't draft people to fill administrative roles, truck driving jobs, supply jobs, the band, public affairs. Those jobs are not filled. They are not dependent upon the draft. The draft specifically is for the purpose of replacing your combatant forces. I got to drive this home. And when people come back at me and say it's an equality issue, you now are mixing emotion with being analytical. Don't give me an emotional argument of equality because there's nothing about the military that has ever been equal. If you're too tall, too fat, too short, have high rates of people being disqualified for various medical issues, don't even have a high school diploma, I discriminated against consistently when I was a recruiter. You were not eligible to join if you could not meet the criteria of the military. We're not talking a civilian job here that happens to wear a uniform. We are talking about the purpose of the military, which is to overwhelm and destroy the enemy. Now, when you water this down into an equality issue, you are not using your analytical skills, and you're now just trying to present this as a job that anybody can do or should be able to do. It is not the case. We are not discriminating against intangibles such as race that people cannot help. We are not discriminating against religion. We are discriminating basically to ensure that we are a force of readiness with physically fit people that are capable to fight in combat. Combat readiness is the critical reason the Marine Corps did the study a few years ago to push back on President Obama's policy. When the study was completed, it was an overwhelming data that demonstrated this would be a lethal mistake putting women in combat. Here's why. With the injury rate being 3 to 10 times the rate of men, and with only a 69% performance rate on the integrated units, male and female versus non-integrated, you now are looking at a slower, less performing unit. You now are looking at a higher rate of injury. What happens when women get injured? You have to replace them. I dare to challenge the liberals out there to go to the VA and force the VA to reveal the number of disabilities of women per capita compared to men. Do men get injured? Absolutely they do. But there is a higher rate among women. Hip displacement is a huge one. Fractures. We're talking about spinal compression. We're talking about a wider range of activities that this force of the combatant load and the endurance of being in field operations for long periods of time take a heavier toll on women than men. This is biological. Now, we get a lot of women that will say, well, I don't want a woman in combat with my husband, and men that say it will distract the men. I appreciate those emotional arguments, but you're not going to win the argument on emotion. You got to point out the data that demonstrates it's less effective. Let's explain what infantry is. It's like going into a mixed martial arts cage with an enemy. Hand-to-hand combat is real. It happened in Fallujah. It's happened in Iraq. We've seen this with ISIS fighters. Are you going to put your daughter in a mixed martial arts cage, the most fit female on the planet, with a male mixed martial artist? The answer would obviously be no. because she would never be equal to that man in her performance. It's not about equality. She cannot equally defend herself. The enemy often fights on methamphetamines and various other drugs and toxins. And this was seen in Fallujah because many of the fighters would not fall when they were shot. They still proceeded to fight, and it became knife combat. The soldiers and Marines there talk about the bloody outcome of Fallujah. So people also will throw at me, well, what about Israel? Israel pulled its women off of the combatant front lines long ago when they saw it was ineffective. It also is a force that also recognizes that the women who must serve by mandated is a different circumstance than the United States. You're talking about a country the size of New Jersey that is surrounded by people that want to destroy and kill them. People throw at me.
Well, thank you so much for giving us that real data-driven look at this. Because I think for a lot of people, as you referenced, this is a sort of an emotional case. They want to talk about equality and a political agenda. And you're setting that aside and saying this is really about the data. And really, I think bottom line, it's about our national security. How do we best defend our nation? And the data is clear from what you've said that we are better prepared to defend ourselves if we put men in those combat roles.
Absolutely. And this is one issue that I had briefed President Trump on, because the Pentagon basically buried this and did not even tell him that we have, that we may have a concern here. We have lifted the combat exemption for women based upon zero data. Essentially, this is like putting women in the NFL. Women overwhelmingly suffer more injury than men because they cannot rebuild muscle the same rate as men. Let's be honest. I could work out all day long and I'm never going to have the huge biceps, the enormous thighs, and look like I'm going to go out there and be the Incredible Hulk. I don't have testosterone, which impedes our muscle rejuvenation and healing, which is critical. So essentially now we are trying to make this an equality issue when it absolutely is absurd, because the number of women that will actually qualify for military service is such disproportionately lower than men. And not only that, being able to replace combatant forces would be one out of thousands of women that we're going to filter through to find that one at the taxpayer's expense. It's not practical, it's not logical, and it's become emotional.
Thank you so much, Jessie Jane Duff, for joining us today. Your insights, your expertise, and your knowledge are greatly appreciated. We're so happy to have your voice on this issue. And thanks for everyone joining us with Americans for Limited Government News.